I want to express my appreciation first to Dr. Karen Sigmund of the AFA and the leadership of AFA for inviting me to speak at this fantastic conference, and to my Korean American conservative friends dispersed among the audience here. I'd first like to speak to you for a few moments. I'm going to speak very quickly, as quick as Ben Shapiro, because I have a lot of information to cover. I'd like to speak to you for a few moments about the threat posed to free people and free institutions by the Democratic Party, and especially its current top leaders. This is a party, the Democratic Party, whose leaders condemn, persecute, prosecute, harass, and even jail the innocent while defending and even appointing to high positions some of those radical elements in society. It is a party whose leaders sometimes make a show of supporting the nation and its military, but who are actually anti-American to their very cores. It is a party whose leaders have proposed and implemented anti-free market policies destructive of prosperity, such as increasing burdensome regulations, attacking successful businesses, increasing the minimum wage, and espousing the hateful Marxist rhetoric of class warfare. It is a party whose leaders have turned a blind eye to illegal immigration, and which has seriously weakened the nation's defense preparations and security. It is a party whose leaders, who in some cases have been deeply corrupt, but who nevertheless accuse others of corruption. It is a party whose leaders enjoy the sympathy of the entertainment world, a largely compliant mainstream news media and academia, which are powerful forces influencing society through their left-wing biases. It is a party wherein Marxists and other radical extremists can and do reach the highest levels of government leadership. It is a party whose leaders loudly boast of their commitment to the have-nots, but who are themselves rigid elitist ideologues who mouth leftist shibboleths while actually practicing the worst form of crony capitalism. It is a party which has been adept at intimidating and silencing its critics and seeks to purge its opponents from public and private institutions. It is a party whose leaders seek to limit liberties by modifying the very words of the Constitution. It is a party whose leaders are closely tied to leftist labor union bosses and derive much power from the political activism and votes of deeply radical unions, especially the far-left teachers' union. It is a party whose leaders impose senseless environmental rules which retard economic development, restrict freedom, and are actually counterproductive in terms of the environment. It is a party whose leaders refuse to condemn violent street thugs. It is a party whose rank-and-file activists are increasingly unfriendly to our great friend and ally of Israel. It is a party whose leaders, while loudly accusing conservatives of being reactionaries, have themselves promoted hate campaigns. It is a party whose leaders have contempt for people like you and I. Of course, not all members of the Democratic Party behave in such a manner or hold such views, but many of the party's leading officials and thinkers and legislators and activists do, as well as many of its brainwashed rank-and-file supporters. Now, at this point, I have a major clarification to make. In all of the foregoing statements I have made, in all I have just described, I refer to the Democratic Party of South Korea. The Democratic Party of South Korea, known in Korean as the Minju Party, which is currently the majority ruling party in South Korea under the leadership and ideological sway of the dangerous leftist President Moon Jae-in and his various extremist allies within his increasingly authoritarian administration and among powerful leftist civic groups. Moon and his party, in spite of misleading first appearances and carefully crafted self-portrayals to the contrary, are leftist to the core, sympathetic to China and North Korea, have strong anti-American tendencies in their very DNA. In South Korea, as in most countries of the world, leftists tend to be anti-American and incidentally anti-Israel, whereas conservatives tend to be very pro-American and incidentally very pro-Israel. Having just returned 2 days ago from the first ever CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference held in Korea, where I spoke, this is the most opportune moment for me and the others here on the panel to speak to you about the very serious situation in South Korea. As we all have been viewing the scenes and reading reports about the struggles of people of Hong Kong and Venezuela and Iran against leftist or jihadist tyranny, you may not have noticed, unless you're among the few lucky enough to receive my regular email blast, that in recent years, and most particularly since the coming to power in mid-2017 of the dangerous, disastrous leftist regime of Moon Jae-in, that there has been in South Korea what our friend Dennis Prager often refers to in the U.S. context as a peaceful civil war of great and growing intensity unfolding in our long-term ally and free world outpost of South Korea. Before sharing further details with you about this struggle, it's important first to explain to you and emphasize just why this is important to us here and how much it's very relevant to us as Americans, as conservatives, as decent people, who I'm sure, knowing this AFA crowd, are certainly not isolationists. South Korea is currently a cockpit, not only of internal struggle between conservatives and leftists, but even more importantly, from a world perspective, the center of a struggle for East Asia, between, on the one hand, the forces of liberty represented by the US, by Korean conservatives, and by Japan, and on the other hand, by the forces of tyranny represented by Communist China, by Korean leftists, and of course by North Korea. If South Korea, with its economic power, its tremendously resourceful people, and its highly strategic location were to be directly dominated by North Korea, or in a broader sense by China, if it were merely to be essentially neutralized or Finlandized, to use the Cold War term, that would be a tremendous blow to US national security interests, to our whole alliance network in Asia, to the cause of human freedom, and of course would be a true disaster for the people of South Korea. Can anyone seriously argue that a South Korea moving away from the West, away from a free democratic order, and into the wretched orbit of China and North Korea would be anything less than a calamity? With all due respect to the inhabitants of the Grand Duchy, we're not talking about Luxembourg here, after all. We're talking about a nation, South Korea, of over 50 million people with a world-class economy and technology sector, the second largest percentage of Christians in East Asia, only after the Philippines. The class of modern ideologies in South Korea obviously predates 2017, when Moon unfortunately came to power. There were communist and anti-communist elements within the forces fighting for Korea's independence from Japanese colonial rule. During the Korean War, there were anti-communist partisans operating in the north and pro-communist partisans operating behind the lines in the south. During the period of authoritarian rule and rapid economic development, before South Korea became a fully democratic state in the late 1980s, Marxist-Leninists and pro-North Korean activists of various factions infiltrated the movement for democracy, and under the fraudulent guise of struggling for civil liberties, were actually boring from within, to use the old communist term, and sought to build not democracy, but rather a socialist state aligned with the North. These assorted leftist, Marxist, and pro-North activists, some of whom initiated their activities, including advocacy of armed communist revolution and pledges of unity and loyalty to the North, after the advent of full democracy in the South, and began in earnest what we here, in a prior successful AFA conference, termed a classic Gramscian long march through the institutions, deeply infiltrating and in some cases essentially dominating certain political circles, unions, mainstream media, and academia, the so-called commanding heights of society. These activists, some garden variety leftists with anti-US views, and other hardcore communists and followers of the North Korean dictatorship, are known in Korea as the 386 generation, sometimes known as Jusapa forces, for their devotion to North Korea's official state ideology of Juche, otherwise known as Kim Il-sung-ism. Some of these forces played key roles in previous left-wing administration in South Korea, the regime of President Roh Moo-hyun, who did not hide his contempt for America, and who rode to electoral victory in 2002 under the guidance of his skillful leftist campaign manager and later advisor, Moon Jae-in. A former U.S. Defense Secretary described Roh, who was Moon's political and ideological mentor, as being crazy and anti-American. Jumping 10 years ahead, in late 2012, after a series of particularly serious and deadly armed provocations by North Korea, South Koreans elected a conservative, national security-minded, and pro-US president named Park Geun-hye, the nation's first female leader. But from the day she was inaugurated, she was vilified in an almost non-stop campaign of vicious, often misogynist slander, including the most outlandish conspiracy theories. And she was finally impeached and removed from office after a left-wing news network supposedly discovered a kind of dossier of dubious provenance on a laptop computer, allegedly including evidence of an improper relationship with trust and favoritism towards a friend and confidant. The mainstream media in Korea savaged her. Leftist civic groups and radical unions staged mass street protests against her, and she was impeached by the legislature based largely on news reports, including by the votes of some in her own party who never liked her and voted to impeach her. After almost no legislative debate, and even before solid evidence had been produced, the impeachment was upheld by the South Korean Constitutional Court in a trial noted for its numerous substantive political and procedural improprieties and irregularities, in spite of an aggressive, able, and persuasive defense by my friend lawyer Kim Kyung-woo and by lawyer Seo Seok-gu in Korea and others. A snap election was then called, for which the conservative forces were in a state of shock and dejection and entirely unprepared. As a result, In spite of gaining only 41% of the vote, Moon Jae-in won over two other candidates who fatally split the opposition vote. During the campaign for president, Moon reportedly refused an interview with a Wall Street Journal correspondent, and instead he granted an exclusive one-on-one interview with an American Marxist. At one point, during the campaign, Moon stated that for the good of South Korea, Korean conservatives would have to be burned out of existence. That was Moon's opinion and his plan for Korea's bitter clingers and Korea's deplorables. Repeatedly and anti-democratically, asserting that based on what he termed the revolution, which led to the overthrow of President Park, not his election per se, Moon claimed that he had a mandate to fundamentally transform Korea's politics, economy and society and foreign relations, pledging that he would totally cleanse the nation of its long accumulated evils. This signaled the start of a nationwide and comprehensive purge of conservative, pro-U.S. government officials, bureaucrats, high-ranking military, intelligence and police officers, state prosecutors, and even non-government figures at private institutions, such as media company editors and reporters, academics, business leaders, whom he and his loyal allies forced out of office through a diabolical combination of threats, pressure from militant union allies, and trumped-up charges, including on bogus grounds, for example, of what they call criminal defamation, which even resulted in the pre-trial jailing of conservative journalists who had simply accused a leftist journalist of being biased. Funding for conservative groups and think tanks, such as the Center for Free Enterprise, where I had lectured there, dried up overnight as their donors were subtly or not so subtly encouraged to end their financial support for conservative. Well-to-do Koreans began moving their assets, in many cases their families, overseas. Guests on news shows, including Americans, were advised by producers to tone down any criticism of Moon's policies, and administration officials there, having already largely cowed most of the mainstream media into a fearful subservience, have expressly and frequently threatened and attempted to compel YouTube to shut down the channels of conservative critics of Moon. Funding for government-affiliated North Korean defectors and North Korean human rights groups has been slashed or eliminated entirely, and private North Korean human rights groups have been most specifically targeted for politically motivated investigations based on trumped-up charges, even subjected to police raids in order to pressure them to keep quiet and not complain too much about, for example, the execution of Christians in North Korea. Moon behaved obsequiously on visits to China and North Korea, and he and some of his officials have had friendly words for Mao, for Ho Chi Minh, and even a North Korean military officer who served in the Korean War invading the South. Moon had even written in one of his memoirs that he felt great joy upon reading of the communist conquest of South Vietnam and the failure of U.S. efforts to save that nation. He failed to attend a ceremony paying tribute to U.S. and other foreign troops killed defending South Korea during the Korean War due to rain. And he declared that anyone using the insult commie or pinko in his nation in reference to other Koreans was a traitor. In recent months, to shift attention away from his disastrous leftist economic policies, which have devastated the South Korean economy, Moon and his minions have decided to target Japan with a government-coordinated left nationalist hate campaign against all things Japanese. Moon used this opportunity to withdraw from a vitally important military sharing agreement with Japan to the delight of China and North Korea. This move caused deep anger in the Trump administration, and U.S. officials frankly stated that Moon's rash and dangerous decision would make it harder for the U.S. to defend South Korea and would actually put U.S. forces at greater risk. After such criticism of Moon by the U.S., he and his foreign ministry angrily summoned the U.S. ambassador to Seoul to relay the demand that the U.S. stop all public criticism of Moon's attempts to break up the trilateral Korea-Japan-U.S. alliance. A few days later, a new dispute erupted over the extent to which a U.S. general would be able to control South Korean forces on the peninsula in the event of an emergency. Moon's administration, at the very highest levels, is filled with supposedly former Marxist radicals, pro-North ideologue, even once violent anti-American activists. Until recently, for example, Moon's top advisor, his chief of staff, was an extreme left radical who led a pro-North group which had plotted the firebombing of U.S. diplomatic facilities in South Korea. The floor leader of Moon's Democratic Party was also a hardcore pro-North anti-U.S. radical leader, and his new justice minister, Cho Guk, whose appointment Moon rammed through in the face of massive public opposition and protest, was a member of a communist group, the Justice Minister, in the 1990s, who had sought to obtain weapons and explosives to stage an armed revolution in the South to eliminate the bourgeoisie. This Justice Minister, Cho Guk, also said it was disgusting that bookstores in the South were selling conservative traitorous books, and he made comments which referenced the impaling of conservative traitors with bamboo spears as had been the practice of communist guerrillas in the South during the Korean War. The Moon administration, particularly at its highest levels, is like a rogues gallery of extreme leftists, some outright communists, and adherents of North Korean ideology. Moon's new ambassador to the U.S. has been on record as stating that President Trump was treacherous. And one of Moon's important national security advisors is an odd fellow. He was at first pro-U.S. when studying here. Then he became, and now is, rather anti-U.S. He's an odd character. First he was a Christian, then a convert to Islam, and now he's apparently an atheist who has publicly questioned the need for the alliance with the U.S. and is known to be sympathetic to China. In the South Korea of Moon Jae-in, conservative politicians who burn North Korean flags are indicted for holding a rally without a permit. But those who burn U.S. and even South Korean flags are not punished under relevant laws. Fanatical and violent pro-North Korean thugs can put up wanted posters in Seoul threatening the lives of North Korean defectors and conservative activists. Democratic Party staffers can use sledgehammers to try and break down the doors of offices occupied by conservatives, and the leftist mayor of Seoul can hire gangster-type thugs to brutally beat conservative activists who would set up tents in downtown Seoul, while the tents of leftist groups a few feet away were allowed to remain unmolested for years. Moon and his Democratic Party have attempted and are still seeking to remove the term freedom, from South Korea's constitution so that the nation would be described merely as a democracy and no longer as a free democracy. Here in the U.S., shockingly and completely without precedent, right here, visiting members of Moon's Democratic Party, top advisors to his regime, South Korean diplomats in the U.S., including the Consul General in L.A., attend meetings of and warmly greet hardcore Korean American supporters of North Korea, America-hating fanatics, terrorist supporters, infamous racists, local Communist Party leaders, and overt vicious anti-Semites. It's scandalous that officials of Moon regime and members of his party and his diplomats in the U.S. have been associating with these lowlifes here in the U.S., including here in L.A. Pro-North Korean pro-U.S. conservatives have consistently maintained that Moon and his allies have deliberately and dishonestly tried to mislead the Trump administration about the true intentions of Kim Jong-un, and that Moon and his top officials have effectively been siding with the North, almost double-teaming the U.S. Even the New York Times, which, as you may guess, has been sympathetic to the Moon regime, admitted that the South Korean ambassador to the U.S. had essentially been acting as a representative on behalf of North Korea, pleading their case. You may not have heard any of this information before. It may be new to you, since it's only been for the most part reported in the Korean language, and due to the fact that many Seoul-based foreign journalists are left-leaning fans of Moon and his policies, who have in some cases openly expressed their deep contempt for the pro-U.S. conservative forces in the South. Now that you're aware of what has been happening in South Korea over the past few years, and now that you're familiar with the true nature of the Moon regime and its allies, you'll surely agree with the author, Fox News contributor, China expert, and America Conservative Union Foundation board member, my friend Gordon Chang, who has written in this situation about his booklet, Losing South Korea, published by the Conservative Encounter Books, and has called on all of us, American conservatives, to oppose Moon Jae-in lest he further imperil the U.S.-Korea alliance and with it our own strategic position in East Asia, as well as the very freedom of South Korea. Incidentally, Gordon had wanted to be here today, but he's busy in China and Hong Kong and Asia, so he sends his regrets. Speaking on Fox News, when Moon was interviewed during a Fox broadcast during a U.S. visit, Moon was directly asked about his repression and censorship of conservative critics. Moon laughed and denied such measures. He said all such reports were fake news. But my conservative journalist friends who were in prison at that time in the South, and conservative academics who had been pushed out of their jobs, would no doubt have reacted bitterly to Moon's dishonest denials. As if this were not enough bad news about South Korea, there are also a few more aspects of the political situation there which are unfortunately quite similar to what we face as Americans. Just like here, there are in Korean society people who live their lives in blissful ignorance of the political life of their nation, want nothing whatsoever to do with civic affairs, which they never think about. These are the Korean equivalent of our own young Americans who you see Jesse Waters interviewing on Fox News on Hollywood Boulevard or on Miami Beach, and the ones who hilariously, appallingly believe U.S. fought Britain in World War II, or who don't recognize a photo of President Reagan, or who think the Constitution was written in 1965, or who can't even name one branch of the U.S. government. Fortunately for Korea, sadly for us, insofar as their educational system is not sunk quite so low as our own, they don't seem to have as many tuned-out ignoramuses as we seem to have here. There is also, in South Korea, a very large group of good people in their version of our own silent majority who do indeed follow current events, who are politically sophisticated and are conservative in political outlook, but for various reasons do not take an active part in political struggle, even though they're opposed to the leftist Moon regime and its ruinous policies. We know the type very well. In discussions with them, they agree with our political views, but they simply don't want to become involved in any form of political activism other than maybe voting. In South Korea, these right-minded but politically inactive people are known as shy conservatives. They'll watch conservative YouTube channels, they'll complain about the left, but you can't get them to come out to a political event or post anything on social media or volunteer. Sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? How many times have we tried to get our friends, the shy conservative friends, to come out to an AFA event? Finally, and to end on an optimistic note, there are the true conservatives, the activists, our spiritual brethren and sisterin, and our friends. To describe them and explain their views is not difficult, because they not only face many of the same challenges we do as American conservatives and patriots, but they also share many of the same views as we do about a wide variety of issues. When one hears them lamenting the leftist indoctrination in academia, the leftist bias of mainstream news media, the political muscle of leftist union bosses, the stupidity of leftist entertainers, leftist censorship of some internet search engines, and attempts of the left to generally silence them and portray them as extremists, they sound just like one of us here in the U.S. If a typical Korean conservative were to call you up on the phone and talk to you about conservatism and leftism, and if you were to speak in fluent English, of course, without any Korean accent, you would think you were listening to Mark Levin. I respect them, I admire them, I appreciate them, and I genuinely like them. I respect Korean conservatives because they tend to be more, in a sense, directly active than American conservatives in some ways. For example, every single weekend since late 2016 and right up to this weekend, the present time, they've been braving bitter cold and snow in the winter, sweltering heat and humidity in the summer. They've turned out in numbers ranging literally from the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands to protest against the leftist Moon regime and its dangerous policies, and to show their support for America and their commitment to our alliance. They listen to conservative speakers, and then they march en masse through downtown streets, waving what has become their symbol, the Korean national flag, known in Korean as the Taegukgi, as well as American flags, large and small, even Israeli flags. Some of their speeches and signs and banners are in English because they want to appeal to us, to the U.S. government, to the American people as a whole, and especially they want to appeal to us, their fellow conservatives who love liberty. Their English messages may not always be expressed in perfect spelling or grammar, but their meanings are crystal clear, even if they're mocked or ignored by some left-wing foreign journalists based in Seoul. You can see the signs and banners every weekend on Korea's conservative YouTube channels, which have blossomed in response to leftist domination of the mainstream media and a thirst for truth about the failures and scandals of the leftist Moon regime. Their signs read, SOS, thank you, America. We love our American allies. Do not remove the U.S. Army from Korea. President Trump, please do not trust Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. Let's strengthen the blood-forged ties between the U.S. and Korea. Release innocent President Park Geun-hye. If things continue this way, we'll end up like South Vietnam. Moon Jae-in out. Stop the destruction of the nation's defense and economy. We hate communism. Moon is betraying and deceiving President Trump. Don't believe the garbage you hear from the leftist news media. We will never forget the sacrifices of the U.S. military during the Korean War. We don't hate Japan. We don't hate Japan. We hate the Chinese communist regime. We want a free republic, not a socialist people's democracy. No suicidal confederation with North Korea. I admire these Korean conservatives because of their enthusiastic love for America and for Americans, and their willingness to proudly and publicly declare their support for the U.S., particularly for the U.S. military, at the very real risk that they will face political retaliation and harassment. Some conservative professors have even lost their job for having spoken out or marched in these mass conservative rallies. Does it sound familiar to you, Karen? I I appreciate Korean conservatives because they're strongly opposing the anti-American leftist forces in their society, and they're passionately defending our country and its values. They're standing up not only for their liberty, but for us and our interests as well. I genuinely like Korean conservatives because, like us, they're truly fine people. Sure, they speak a different language, they tend to like spicier foods, they have different social customs, but they're nevertheless our kinds of people. I can testify this as one who knows them and works with them. Our own Karen Sigmund can testify to this, as she experienced a tremendously warm, almost rock star welcome when she participated in the events of a Korean-American conservative group right here in LA of lawyer Peter Kim, which all of you are most welcome to attend in the future. Please come out to Koreatown. American tourists in Seoul who happen to pass by or even join in these rallies there are treated with great honor as if they're heroes. When I was at such rallies in 2017, 2018, and just a week ago, I frankly found it a little embarrassing when you have men and women, even respected elders in their 80s, rush up to me and bow and say how grateful they are for my being there and how they love America and Americans. It's not easy to have to turn down a dozen dinner invitations within the space of an hour. These Korean conservatives, by proudly waving American flags, standing to attention as they play the Star-Spangled Banner at their rallies, and by marching up and down with banners in English, are making a direct and heartfelt appeal to President Trump, to all Americans, specifically to us as American conservatives, whom they trust. They worry they're on the verge of losing their country, and American conservatives who are familiar with Korea, including, of course, Korean-American conservatives, worry that the U.S. may lose an important ally in the region. The American neglect of and unfamiliarity with the freedom movement in South Korea may be due to a kind of normalcy bias with regard to the country. It's a feeling that maybe things aren't really that bad there, and in some cases causes us to estimate or even dismiss this danger because it is erroneously assumed that, having been a democracy and a stalwart ally of the U.S., South Korea will always be so, regardless of the fact that its domestic politics and foreign relations have recently been hijacked by a group of leftist ideologues who are no friends of America. As you can see, I personally, although I am not a one-issue type of person, I've taken up the cause of our conservative Korean friends, and in doing so, I feel I'm in good company. About 80 years ago, there were young Americans who went to Great Britain in 1940 and early 1941 to join the Royal Air Force and take part in the freedom struggle there against the Nazis, even though America was still officially neutral and isolationist sentiments were strong. 35 years ago, President Reagan, who termed the border between North and South Korea the front line of freedom in the world, was a strong advocate of actively aiding and speaking out on behalf of those struggling for freedom against tyranny around the world, like for solidarity in Poland, be they Soviet Jewish dissidents in Moscow or freedom fighters on the borders of Sandinista Nicaragua. Even as we meet here today, there are young Americans in Israel serving in the Israeli armed forces, defending freedom and Western values there, just as our first line of defense against our jihadist enemies have been doing in various places throughout the world for decades and currently at this moment. Just as my own beloved father, may his memory be a blessing, did as a naval officer in combat during World War II. I therefore join our Korean conservative friends and allies in appealing to all of you to support their cause in any way that you can, to the best of your ability in the U.S. If Karen or I let you know of a good event in Koreatown, a protest here, come out and join us. We must not turn our backs on them. We must not ignore their struggle, because they're also fighting our fight against leftism, against those in their country who sympathize with North Korea, who sympathize with China, and in support of the U.S.-Korean alliance, and in support of our own vital national interests. Thank you very much.